Take off those ridiculous medals. My father's voice roared through the ballroom, cutting through the clink of crystal and the soft hum of polite conversation. The sound felt like a physical weight, pressing into my chest. I stood there, stiff in my army blue mess uniform, the fabric tight across my shoulders. The stage lights were harsh, blindingly white against the polished floor, but the look in Harold Rourke's eyes was colder. He gripped that gold ceremonial pen so tightly his knuckles had turned the color of bone. 200 guests, the city's elite, business partners, donors froze. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the faint, metallic tang of the hors d'oeuvre. I didn't blink. I couldn't. I was 38 years old, a lieutenant colonel in Army cyber operations, and I had spent nearly a decade cleaning up the messes my father made to keep his company afloat. But tonight, that ended. They are not yours to remove, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Harold didn't care for refusals. His face flushed a deep, ugly crimson as he lunged forward. His hand swept out, a blur of motion, and slapped me hard across the face. My head whipped to the side. The sting was immediate, sharp and burning, bringing tears to my eyes that I refused to let fall. My cheek throbbed, and for a second, the room tilted, a ringing sound echoing in my ears, but I caught my balance. I looked at the audience. The cameras were already up. Phones were recording. I didn't reach for my face. I didn't beg for mercy. I just stood my ground. He raised his hand for a second blow, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Before the strike could land, a firm hand gripped his wrist, locking him in place. I looked up. Retired General Raymond Vale, the executive chairman of Meridian, and my father's ultimate boss, stood between us. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply turned, looked me in the eye, and snapped a crisp, perfect salute. "Lieutenant Colonel Rourke," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried over the hushed room. Our team traced the complaint. 8 words. That was all. 8 words. That was all. The ceremonial folder slipped from Harold's hand and struck the carpet. It opened just far enough for me to see my signature printed beneath a document I had never signed. Harold looked at the page. Then he looked at me. For the first time in my life, my father understood that I had not walked into the ballroom unprepared. 6 weeks earlier, I had been sitting alone in my townhouse when Paige sent me the gala invitation. At the bottom of the attached schedule beneath the ceremonial signing was a space reserved for my endorsement. That was when I realized Harold did not merely want me at the event. He intended to make my silence look like consent. The quiet of my townhouse in Alexandria felt like a sanctuary after the blinding lights of the gala. I sat at my small kitchen table, the one I had picked up from a thrift store 3 years ago. There were no ghosts of Harold Rourke in this room. Every item here, the chipped ceramic mug in my hand, the worn rug under my feet, the bills stacked neatly by the door belonged to me, not to a family foundation, not to a father who traded in human loyalty, and certainly not to a company that treated my life as a marketing asset. My phone vibrated against the wood, a sharp, insistent sound. Paige. I let it ring. She would be looking for a script, for someone to tell her that the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. But I had no script for her. I only had the truth, and that was a currency she wasn't ready to spend yet. 12 months ago, the distance between my father and me had felt bridgeable, even if the foundation was shaky. He had called me, his voice smooth and paternal, asking for help with a veteran hiring initiative at Rourke Sentinel Systems. It sounded noble. It sounded like the man I had spent my childhood trying to earn the approval of. I had provided him with a list of public resources, names of nonprofit organizations, and a basic roadmap for how to genuinely support veterans transitioning into the civilian workforce. I didn't ask for a dime, nor did I ask for recognition. Seeing those men and women find stable employment was enough. It was supposed to be a private favor, a daughter helping her father do something that actually mattered. How naive I had been. The first crack in the facade appeared 9 months before the gala, when the company released an internal newsletter. There I was, spread across a glossy page, my army uniform stiff and formal, standing in a room full of Rourke Sentinel employees. The caption claimed my involvement was proof of the company's military-grade integrity. I stared at the photo, the smell of fresh ink lingering in the air, and felt the first cold prickle of realization. I wasn't a partner, I was a prop. 6 months out, the internal newsletter became a public campaign. Trusted by those who defend America. That was the slogan plastered across billboards in Northern Virginia and on every social media platform the company owned. They hadn't just used my photo, they had cherry-picked a quote from a casual family conversation, splicing it into an endorsement I had never given. I didn't pick up the phone to call Harold. My fingers flew across the keyboard, saving the website as a PDF, logging the timestamp, and capturing every trace of the lie. I had learned that the hard way. If it wasn't documented, it hadn't happened. My email to the company was precise, stripped of all emotion, and carbon copied to my civilian counsel. I demanded the immediate removal of my name, my rank, and my likeness from all marketing materials. I made it clear that I was not a spokesperson, nor was I a consultant. 2 days later, my father stood in the center of my living room, clutching a cashier's check for $50,000. He called it a gift, a gesture of parental support for my mortgage. But the price tag was buried in the way he stood, chest puffed out, waiting for me to thank him, waiting for me to fold. I didn't reach for the check. I stayed seated, keeping the distance between us like a physical barricade. My house had been refinanced 3 years ago, paid for with my own salary and the savings I had scraped together during my deployments. He didn't know that. He assumed because he owned so much that everything around him was eventually for sale. "I don't need your money, Harold," I said, the name sounding foreign on my tongue. "I need you to respect the boundary I set." He had laughed then, a dismissive, patronizing sound. It was the same laugh he used when he wanted to convince me that I was being too sensitive, that I didn't understand the complexities of business. He had no idea that I had spent the last several months building a life he couldn't touch. I should have paid closer attention to the look in his eyes when he left. It wasn't the look of a father who had been corrected. It was the look of a strategist who had realized he needed a new approach. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. I walked over to my desk and opened the locked drawer. Inside lay a single, plain file folder. No labels. No identifying marks. Just a chronological index of every interaction I had with his company since the campaign started. It was my insurance, my timeline, and my only way of keeping my head above water. The memory of that night at the dinner table, the one where he had mocked me for keeping records, bubbled up. He had ridiculed me for documenting every hour of my day, every email I sent, every conversation that carried weight. He said it was a sign of a rigid, joyless personality. I knew better. In a world where my father could invent facts, my timeline was the only thing that kept the truth from being rewritten. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I felt the familiar weight of the responsibility I'd shouldered for years, but for the first time it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a weapon. I had done my part. I had tried to handle this with the grace he claimed to value, but grace had only emboldened him. Something had to change, and I had already set the gears in motion. My phone lit up again, an email notification. It was from Nicole Mercer, my father's chief communications officer. The subject line was blank. I tapped the screen, my pulse quickening. The body of the email contained only a single sentence. "If she will not approve the story, we need a different record." I read it once, twice. The cold clarity of it was absolute. They weren't just using me. They were building a narrative that required my complicity, and if I wouldn't provide it, they would manufacture it. I didn't panic. I saved the email, tagged it in my index, and added the timestamp to my master log. They thought I was alone. They thought I was the rigid, joyless daughter who would eventually cave because that was what I had always done. But they had forgotten one thing. I was a planner. I spent my days in the army mapping out threats and securing digital infrastructure. I had been planning for this since the day I realized my own father was the primary threat to my honor. I walked to the window, looking out at the dark street below. A car was parked under the streetlight, just idling. I didn't recognize it. Probably just a neighbor, or someone lost. But the instinct to monitor, to track, to secure was wired into my marrow. I watched until the taillights finally faded away into the night. The gala was coming. I knew it, and he knew it. He wanted to parade me around like a prize, to force a signature that would turn my silence into consent. He wanted to build his legacy on the back of my reputation. I picked up the draft I had written for my attorney. It was a formal request for an independent ethics review. I didn't want to burn his company down. I had never wanted that. I had only ever wanted the right to exist apart from his shadow. But as I read the words, I realized that if he chose to light the match, I would be the one to hold the extinguisher, and he would be the one left standing in the ashes. The silence of the townhouse felt heavier now, charged with the weight of the coming confrontation. I had lived a life of quiet sacrifice, of absorbing the shocks he caused, of shielding Paige, of maintaining a calm, professional facade. That was the life I had built to protect myself, but he had finally pushed too far into a space I would not surrender. I would go to the gala. I would walk into that room, face the lights, and look him in the eye. I had the timeline. I had the evidence stored in 3 separate locations, none of which he could access. I had the truth, and for the first time, I wasn't going to let him bury it. I went to the closet and pulled out my uniform. It was perfectly pressed, the ribbons and medals aligned with military precision. I ran a hand over the fabric. This uniform stood for something larger than my father's business, larger than his ego, larger than the petty games he played to secure a contract. It stood for duty, for honor, and for the integrity he was so willing to trade away. He thought he could command me, could force me into his version of the story. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I reached into the closet and pulled out my dress shoes, placing them on the floor with a rhythmic thud. I was ready. Every email, every timestamp, every ignored refusal, it was all leading to this. I wouldn't run. I wouldn't hide. I would stand in that ballroom, in front of everyone he wanted to impress, and I would make sure that he finally heard the one word he had spent a lifetime trying to erase from my vocabulary. No. I walked back to the kitchen, feeling a strange, hollow sense of peace. The storm was coming, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the wind. I was the one who had built the shelter. He had no idea what was waiting for him at the signing ceremony. He thought it was a victory lap. He had no idea it was a funeral. The morning air in my office felt thin, charged with a static I could taste on the back of my tongue. Colonel Bennett sat behind his desk, the fluorescent lights humming overhead in a rhythmic, irritating buzz. Beside him, the legal advisor looked down at a stack of manila folders, his expression a mask of official indifference. I remained at attention, my hands resting lightly on my knees, every muscle in my body coiled. Lieutenant Colonel Rourke, Colonel Bennett began, his tone stripped of the familiarity we had built over years of service. We have received an anonymous complaint concerning your conduct. The words landed with the weight of stones. I didn't reach for my phone to document this. I didn't need to. I knew what kind of accusation it would contain before he opened the file. I did not yet know how far my father had gone to construct it. It was the predictable next move in my father's game of chess. I am listening, Colonel, I replied, my voice steady enough to mask the fire burning in my gut. He laid out the allegations with clinical precision: improper endorsement of a civilian entity, undisclosed compensation, use of military status for private commercial gain. Each charge was a lie, a carefully constructed narrative designed to dismantle my career by attacking the only thing I valued more than my life: my integrity. "The complaint is specific," the legal advisor added, glancing over his glasses at me. "It alleges that you have been actively involved in Rourke Sentinel Systems marketing campaigns, specifically mentioning a bank transfer as proof of compensation." I felt my stomach tighten, but I kept my breathing slow. There was no bank transfer. There couldn't be, because I had never accepted a penny. But Harold was arrogant enough to manufacture a transaction that would leave a paper trail he thought he could control. "I have never authorized such an endorsement, nor have I accepted compensation," I said, meeting Bennett's gaze without wavering. "You are currently under a preliminary administrative review," the colonel stated. "As a precaution, I am removing you from your external speaking panel effective immediately." That was the sting. The panel was one of the most important professional engagements of my year, a chance to mentor service members transitioning into the civilian sector. It was my way of doing good, of building something that wasn't touched by Rourke money. Now, it was gone, stripped away by an anonymous voice and a father's vendetta. I asked 3 questions. What was the scope of the allegation? What was the deadline for my response? What were the protocols for evidence submission? I didn't beg. I didn't defend myself with emotional outbursts. I treated this like the threat assessment it was. I walked out of the office and went straight to my workstation, opening the timeline I had been curating for months. I highlighted the date of the complaint. It had arrived exactly 13 days after I sent my written refusal to Harold. The pattern was too clean, too deliberate. My phone chirped with a message from Diane. I stared at the screen, watching the bubbles pop up. It seemed Harold heard from a friend that an investigation had been opened. Was I all right? Did I need the family lawyer? The audacity of it made my skin crawl. She knew exactly what was happening. They all did. I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I sent a brief, formal email to my personal attorney, Sarah Kim, detailing the meeting and requesting a face-to-face. I should have known then that the reach of their conspiracy was longer than I had dared to imagine. Later that afternoon, a thick packet arrived on my desk, an allegation summary provided for my defense. I flipped through the pages until my eyes caught on a specific sentence quoted from a private family call. "Every time Dad uses my uniform, I feel trapped inside his version of me." My breath hitched. That conversation had happened in a secure private setting 3 months ago. Only Harold, Diane, and Paige had been in the room. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The complaint wasn't just a collection of corporate lies. It was built on intimate, stolen words. The privacy of my own family circle had been weaponized against me, and I was looking at the evidence in my own hands. I didn't let the anger take me. I pushed it into a dark corner of my mind, locking it away. My apartment became a nerve center that evening. I spent hours with Sarah, laying out every document, every email, and every interaction. We established a ironclad index. I changed every password, scrubbed my cloud storage, and severed my father's access to my emergency contacts and power of attorney. I was burning the bridges he had built to my life, one by one. The phone rang at midnight. Harold's private line. "Megan," he said, his voice dripping with that false paternal concern he used when he wanted to convince me he was the savior. "I heard about the review. I have friends in the command structure. I can make this go away." "How did you know there was a complaint, Harold?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the dark room. "Before I even told the family?" There was a silence on the other end, long and calculated. "Every CEO has sources, Megan. But if you sign the statement the legal team is preparing, you won't have to worry about your rank." You won't have to worry about anything." He sounded so confident, so sure that I would choose my career over the truth. He didn't understand that for me, the rank and the integrity were the same thing. I hung up, then sat by the window for a long time, watching the streetlights flicker. I pulled out my journal, my after-action timeline, and wrote down every word of that conversation. I had to be precise. I had to be perfect. If they wanted a war, I would give them one fought with facts, timelines, and legal precision. The next morning, I found myself in the office early, staring at the headers on the complaint packet provided by command. I noticed something that had escaped me in my initial shock. The naming convention of the files was identical to the internal presentation slides I had seen Nicole Mercer use during a family foundation project years ago. I didn't have access to their company servers. I couldn't hack their files, but I had a memory like a steel trap, and I started connecting the dots. Nicole was the architect, but Harold was the master who provided the blueprint. I sat back, the fluorescent light humming above me again. I was alone, and I was under review, and my father was actively trying to destroy my life. But I had one thing he didn't. I had the patience to wait for the system to do its work. I pulled up the company's public website on my private browser. The campaign was still up. I watched the video of myself, my own face, my own voice, being used to sell a narrative that wasn't mine. I should have been worried about my future. I should have been mourning the loss of my external panel, but all I felt was a cold, focused resolve. The complaint had been filed, the review had begun, and the trap was being laid. I just had to make sure I wasn't the one caught inside it. I typed a new entry into my timeline. If they wanted to play with files and forged narratives, they were playing on my ground now. I didn't know who had written the complaint, but I knew whose hands were holding the pen. And as I stared at the screen, I realized that I had already done the hardest part of the work. I had stopped running. The door to my office opened, and Colonel Bennett's assistant stood there, holding a manila folder. "The investigator is ready for your first statement, Colonel." I stood up, adjusting my uniform. I looked into the mirror on the wall, smoothing my hair. I didn't see a victim. I saw a soldier who was ready to defend her ground. I followed the assistant down the hall, my steps light, my mind clear. Harold Rourke thought he could use my own words to bury me. He had no idea how many more words I had left to speak. I entered the room, sat down, and waited for the investigator to ask the first question. I was ready to talk, and for the first time in my life, I wouldn't be saying what my father wanted to hear. I would be saying the truth. The entire, unvarnished truth. And they would have to listen, whether they liked it or not. Sarah Kim's office smelled of expensive leather and dust. She sat behind a massive mahogany desk, her eyes scanning the screen of her laptop with the intensity of a surgeon. I sat across from her, my hands folded, feeling the hum of the air conditioner against the back of my neck. "We received a notification," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, serious register. She tapped a key, turning the laptop so I could see a formal letterhead from Meridian Critical Infrastructure Holdings. It was a preservation notice. The Corporate Ethics Council had officially opened an internal matter regarding a military complaint package. "Does this mean I have access to their files?" I asked, leaning in. Sarah shook her head. "Not even close. This is a protected internal process. The company is treating this as a potential breach of their own ethics policy. They aren't sharing evidence with us, and they certainly aren't inviting you into the boardroom to watch the investigation." "So, I am left waiting?" I asked, feeling the familiar prickle of frustration. "You are left protected," Sarah corrected. "The fact that they sent this notice to me rather than ignoring your request suggests that someone inside that building has flagged the activity as a liability. We cannot go fishing for raw data without compromising the chain of custody. If we touch their internal servers, we become the aggressors. Let them handle the audit. When the discovery phase opens, we will have the leverage we need." I leaned back, trying to reconcile the need for patience with the sheer urgency of my situation. Harold was moving faster than any internal audit could keep up with. He was a master of the stall. I felt as if I were standing on a sinking ship, watching the lifeboats being repaired while the water kept rising. "There is one more thing," Sarah added, her expression hardening. "The formal preservation notice confirms that the investigators are examining records connected to an outside reputation firm. They have not disclosed the invoice or its contents, but the date range overlaps with the complaint against you. The date aligns perfectly with the timeline we established." My jaw tightened. So he used company funds to pay for the smear campaign against his own daughter. "It appears so," Sarah said, tapping her pen against the desk. "But again, that information is currently in the custody of their outside counsel. We cannot use it unless the internal investigation concludes or a court compels its release." I left the office with the bitter taste of helplessness in my mouth. I had played by every rule, every regulation, every standard of professional conduct, while he had spent every cent he could get his hands on to fabricate a reality that would destroy my life. I should have paid attention to the news coming from my sister's social media feed. That evening, I saw photos of a gala announcement. Harold was posing with the leadership of Halcyon Medical Network. The headline shouted about a $50 million contract signing due to take place at the Veterans Forward Scholarship Gala in a few weeks. The promotional deck accompanying the announcement featured a photo of a family gathering, and there I was, caught in a candid moment, my uniform looking official and reassuring. I had never agreed to be part of the Halcyon deal. I had never even heard of the negotiation. I sent the link to Sarah immediately. The next morning I stood in my office, watching the local news ticker crawl across the screen. My father was the face of a $50 million vision, and he was using my career as the collateral to secure it. He was betting that the Halcyon executives wouldn't dig into the ethics of his marketing because the money was too good and the optics were too perfect. A ping sounded on my terminal. It was a message from an internal contact in the company's HR department, a person I had mentored years ago, someone who knew that my support for the veteran initiative was authentic, not transactional. The message was short. "Nicole Mercer has been pulling overtime on a new campaign deck. I heard her say she needed a record that looked official for the board's approval before the signing ceremony." I felt a shiver of cold dread. If he needed an official record, he was going to create one. I immediately sent a preservation notice through Sarah to the Meridian Corporate Ethics Council, explicitly citing the Halcyon contract and the unauthorized use of my name. It was the only move I had. I couldn't reach out to the board members. I couldn't call the Halcyon executives. I had to remain invisible, a ghost in his machine, while he built the trap that would eventually snap shut on his own neck. I had spent weeks thinking about the woman who had deleted the file, the one identified in the audit logs as Claire Donnelly. I didn't know her. I didn't know her face, her history, or her motivations. I only knew that her digital footprint had been used to erase the legal warnings I had sent. Every part of me wanted to reach out, to find her, to see if she was a collaborator or a victim, but I knew that would be a fatal mistake. If she was a whistleblower, my contact would out her. If she was a loyalist, she would warn Harold. I sat at my desk and stared at the empty screen. Every fiber of my being wanted to act, to force a confrontation, to demand a change. Instead, I did the only thing I could do. I opened my timeline. I recorded the date of the Halcyon announcement, the specific details of the campaign deck I'd seen, and the exact timestamp of the preservation notice Sarah had sent. I had to be the person who remembered. That was my burden. 2 days later, the website that hosted the campaign changed. The photo of me, the one in my uniform, had been pulled down. In its place was a generic image of a flag, though the slogan remained. But the cached versions still existed. The internet was a graveyard of abandoned lies, and I had the map. My phone rang. It was Sarah, and she sounded cautious. "Megan, The Ethics Council just sent over a formal verification request. They want you to confirm whether you signed a media release form dated 6 months ago. They claim it was part of the original onboarding for the Veterans Project. I stared at the phone. My hand trembled just for a second before I steadied it. "Tell them no," I said, my voice barely audible. "Tell them I have never seen such a document. Tell them that if a signature exists, it is a forgery." "They will need you to sign an affidavit," Sarah warned. "This is going to be the pivot point. Once you swear to this, there is no turning back. If you are wrong, if a signed document surfaces, you are liable for perjury." "I am not wrong," I answered. "I have never signed anything for them, not a single page." "Understood," Sarah replied. "I will file the response. But Megan, look out. If they have forged your signature, they are already deep into fraud. This is no longer just a reputation smear. If the signature was deliberately copied and used to secure the contract, we may be dealing with serious civil liability and potentially criminal conduct." I hung up and looked at the clock. It was nearly evening. The sky outside my window was turning that deep, bruised purple that signaled the end of a long, exhausting day. I thought about the man who was currently planning the most successful gala of his life, fully intending to sign a contract backed by a lie. He believed he was the architect of my reality. He believed I was the brick that he could move wherever he needed to build his empire. But he had miscalculated. He had assumed that because I was his daughter, I would always prioritize the family's survival over the truth. He had assumed I would never sacrifice the image of the perfect Rourke family to expose the rotting interior. He was wrong. I spent the next hour walking through my townhouse, checking the locks, verifying that every file was backed up, every hard drive encrypted. I was creating a perimeter. I was guarding the only territory I had left, the truth. I sat down at the table again, the one I'd bought myself. I opened the file. I started writing, not a list, but a narrative of the last year. I didn't write it for him. I didn't write it for the board. I wrote it for the investigator who would eventually read it. I wrote it for the day when the truth would be the only thing left standing. I looked at the clock. The seconds were ticking down, each one a step closer to the signing ceremony. I could see him clearly in my mind, standing on that stage with the gold pen in his hand, smiling at the guests, convinced he had finally won. He was going to hold that contract, that $50 million contract, and he was going to look at me and demand that I validate his existence. And in that moment, I realized something that made my heart race. He didn't just want me to sign the form. He wanted to own me. He wanted to make sure that, even in the eyes of the law, I was a product of his design. I didn't blink. I closed the laptop. I didn't have to win today. I didn't have to win tomorrow. I just had to make sure that when the final move came, he was the only one left on the board. I was prepared for the gala. I was prepared for the questions. And most importantly, I was prepared for the lies he had yet to tell. I walked into my bedroom, the space cool and dark. I laid out my uniform, checking the buttons, the ribbons, the brass. It was clean. It was sharp. It was the armor I would wear when I walked into the lion's den. I knew the risk. I knew the weight of the perjury threat. I knew the danger of going up against a man who believed his money could buy the laws of physics. But as I lay in the dark, watching the city lights flicker through the blinds, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The game was no longer being played on his terms. Every move he made, every file he erased, every signature he forged was just another line in my timeline. I had the map, and for the first time, I wasn't just following it. I was the one who had drawn it. Diane sent the invitation to the country club luncheon with a note about family unity that left a bitter taste on my tongue. I sat in my car, staring at the manicured entrance, the sun reflecting off the windshield in a blinding glare. Sarah Kim sat in the passenger seat, her laptop open, reviewing the final parameters of our strategy. "Remember," Sarah said, not looking up from the screen, "we are here for one purpose: to establish the chain of events. Do not let her pull you into a conversation about the family's legacy or the company's reputation. Stick to the questions regarding the origin of the audio recording. I nodded, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I was 38 years old, and yet, walking into that club felt like stepping back into a childhood filled with landmines. I stepped out of the car, adjusting my blazer, and walked toward the entrance. Diane was waiting in the lobby, dressed in muted pastels, looking every bit the graceful matriarch of a foundation that thrived on appearances. "Megan," she said, reaching out to touch my arm. Her skin felt cool, like porcelain. "I am so glad you could make it. Harold has barely slept. He thinks if we just talk, if we just remind ourselves that we are family, this entire situation will dissolve." "Let us get to the point, Diane," I said, walking toward the private dining area. I had requested a table far from the main seating, somewhere I could maintain control over the environment. Once we were seated, I didn't reach for the menu. I pulled a digital voice recorder from my bag not to use, but to remind myself of what was at stake. Diane watched me, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before it returned, polished and precise. "I need to know who produced the audio recording of my therapy session," I said, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of clinking silverware from the distant main room. That was a private consultation. It contained information that ended up in an anonymous complaint against me. Diane sighed, a sound of practiced exhaustion. "Megan, that was a misunderstanding. I recorded the session because I wanted to understand you better. I wanted to see if there was some way I could help bridge the gap between you and your father. I sent it to him because I thought, perhaps, he would realize how much you were struggling. You sent a private, confidential record to the person who was using it to attack my career," I countered, leaning forward. "Did you know he would use it in a formal complaint?" "Of course not." Diane's eyes widened, her hands clasping together on the tablecloth. "I would never want to hurt you. Harold he is a man of business. He has immense pressure on him. I thought if he heard your voice, heard your pain, he would soften. He would make things right." "And the message you sent with it?" I pressed, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The one where you told him to use the part about me feeling trapped? The one where you suggested it would make me sound unstable?" She went pale, the color draining from her face, until she looked as translucent as the crystal glasses on the table. I was just worried. You sounded so lost in that recording. I thought if the firm understood your state of mind, they would be more gentle with you." "Gentle?" I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that drew a glance from a waiter passing by. "You handed him the ammunition to destroy me, Diane. Do not pretend this was an act of mercy." I saw the shift then, the subtle transformation from concerned stepmother to someone cornered. She leaned back, her composure snapping into a defensive posture. "Fine." I gave him the recording. I thought he was trying to protect the company. "Is that so terrible? To protect the legacy your father worked his entire life to build?" "It is terrible when that legacy is built on the destruction of his own child," I said. She looked away, toward the windows overlooking the golf course. "This is all my fault, then. Is that what you want me to say?" I gave him the data. I did not write the complaint. I did not design the legal strategy. "You are blaming me for a business dispute that has nothing to do with me." This was the trap. She was offering me a target, a confession that was just large enough to satisfy my need for the truth, but small enough to shield Harold. She wanted me to accept the blame for the recording, leave, and let her go back to the mansion, leaving Harold's culpability untouched. "You gave him the tools," I said, keeping my eyes locked on hers, "and you knew exactly what he would do with them." I left the club feeling cold despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. I met Sarah at a quiet cafe nearby. She listened as I recounted the conversation, her expression unreadable. "She gave us a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture," Sarah said, writing something on a notepad. She admitted to the recording, but she did everything in her power to distance herself from the actual drafting of the complaint. That aligns with the timeline we got from outside counsel. What did the counsel say? I asked, my voice tight. They have not released the raw findings, Sarah explained. What they have confirmed is that the review now covers records from the Communications Department, the Legal Department, and Harold's executive office. That does not yet prove who drafted each section or who gave the final order. The forensic team still has to establish that chain. I stared at the coffee in front of me. 3 departments were under review, but Harold could still try to isolate the blame and sacrifice someone beneath him. So we wait for the version history, I said. We preserve your evidence, Sarah corrected, and we let the investigators establish who touched each file. Sarah explained, her voice dropping to a whisper. The communications office under Nicole Mercer drafted the narrative. The legal department under Martin Hale refined the language and fabricated the legal justifications. And Harold's executive office gave the final order to include the compensation allegations. I stared at the coffee in front of me. 3 offices, 3 different layers of authority, all working under his direct command. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a systematic attack. I need the evidence, I said. I cannot keep fighting shadows while they hold the physical records. I am still pushing for it, Sarah promised. But there is something else you need to know. We traced the forged signature. Your father requested a scanned copy of your signature from the Family Trust Administrator 2 weeks before the media release was manufactured. Martin Hale was the one who placed the call. I felt the last of my childhood memories of Martin Hale, the man who had sat at our dinner table, the man who had guided us through legal hurdles, dissolve. He had not just acted as an attorney, he had acted as an accomplice to a felony. I spent that night in my townhouse, the silence of the room now heavy with the truth. I looked at the index card in my file, the one that had held my goals since the beginning. I had the confirmation of the actors, the confirmation of the method, and the confirmation of the intent. I was ready. The next morning, I stood in my office, looking at the city skyline. I was a soldier who had spent a lifetime following orders, but I had finally found the order that mattered most. I would not allow them to erase the truth of who I was. I would not allow them to forge my name to a future I had never chosen. I had the piece of information I needed from Diane, even if it wasn't the confession she intended. She had confirmed the direct line of command. She had confirmed that Harold was the sun around which all of this misery orbited. I pulled out my phone and messaged Sarah. Proceed. Get the verification request to the board. I am ready to sign the affidavit. The decision felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. There was no going back now. The board would receive the affidavit, the legal department would have to address the forgery, and the quiet, controlled life I had built would explode into the open. I walked to the window, watching the city wake up, vibrant and indifferent to the wreckage that was about to unfold. I wasn't just defending my rank. I wasn't just defending my career. I was defending the right to exist without being used as an asset. I thought about Paige, trapped in that mansion, waiting for someone to show her that she didn't have to be a prop, either. I didn't know if I could save her, but I could show her the path I had taken. I could show her that the walls my father built were made of paper, and with the right set of facts, they would fall. The day stretched out before me, full of meetings and procedures. I was ready. Every email, every timestamp, every forged signature was a thread in a tapestry that was finally beginning to unravel. They thought they had the power of the legacy, the power of the name, and the power of the office. But I had the record. And in the end, that was the only thing that would survive. I stepped out of my office, the familiar hum of the hallways echoing around me. I walked toward the elevator, my head held high, my pace steady. I was not the daughter he wanted. I was not the victim he expected. I was the person who was going to take it all away. The security guard at the desk nodded as I passed. I didn't see him. I didn't see the lobby or the people rushing to their own lives. I saw the image of that media release, that backdated document, and I saw the moment I would walk into the boardroom and make them look at it until the truth was inescapable. I had the confession. I had the intent. Now, I just had to wait for the gala. The train to the city was crowded, the air filled with the scent of damp wool and stale coffee. I sat in the corner, my hands resting on my knees, watching the suburbs blur into the dense architecture of the downtown. I was going to meet with the outside counsel for one final briefing. We were getting close. "Everything is set," Sarah said when I walked into her office. "The board of directors is preparing an emergency session. They have received your affidavit and they are asking questions about the signature authentication. Your father is losing his grip on the narrative." "Is he still planning to go ahead with the gala?" I asked. "He is," Sarah said, her voice grim. "He believes that the contract signing will be such a massive win for the firm that the board will be forced to overlook the internal issues. He is betting the entire future of the firm on that single moment." I nodded, my thoughts turning to the folder. He had no idea that the gala wouldn't be a win. It would be the final, irreversible piece of evidence. He was going to stand on that stage, in front of the board, in front of the halcyon executives, and he was going to present a forged document as if it were legitimate. "Let him have his moment," I said, my voice cold. "Let him stand on that stage. Let him believe he has won. He is going to hand the evidence to the very people he is trying to impress." Sarah watched me, a hint of concern in her eyes. "This is dangerous, Megan. You know that. Once you are in that room, once he tries to force your hand, it is going to get messy." "It is already messy," I replied. "I am just the one who is finally cleaning it up." I left her office feeling lighter. The path forward was narrow, filled with risks I couldn't fully control, but for the first time, it was my path. I wasn't the pawn in his game anymore. I was the one who had written the rules. I walked back to my car, the cold air stinging my cheeks. I stopped for a moment, looking at the reflection of the city lights on the wet pavement. I was 38 years old, and I was finally becoming the woman I had been trying to hide from the man who raised me. I realized then that Harold wasn't just a businessman. He was a collector of people, a man who curated his relationships to serve his own ends. He had treated my life like a piece of property, something to be managed and leveraged, and he had never bothered to learn who I actually was. He didn't know I was a strategist. He didn't know I was a fighter. He didn't know I was a soldier who believed in honor above approval, power, and family pressure. He was going to lose everything he had spent a lifetime building, not because I hated him, but because I loved the truth more than I loved his approval. That was the one variable he hadn't factored into his equation. I started the engine, the sound filling the small space of the car. I was heading home, heading back to the townhouse, back to the files, back to the truth. The gala was less than 3 weeks away, and in that time, I would build the case that would finally bring his entire house of cards crashing down. I didn't feel lonely. For the first time, I felt surrounded by the evidence of my own agency. I had the records, I had the timeline, and I had the resolve. Harold Rourke had spent years trying to erase me. Now, he would have to face the person he created. I pulled out onto the road, the headlights carving a path through the dark. I wasn't going back to the way things were. I was going back to the fight, and I was going to finish it. I pulled into the driveway, the lights of the townhouse casting a long shadow over the lawn. I sat in the car for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. The house was quiet, secure, and ready. I went inside, the familiar layout greeting me like a friend. I walked to the desk, the index card still lying on the blotter, and I picked it up. I checked off the final item on the list. I had the confession, I had the confirmation. Now, I just had to hold the line until the gala. I sat at the table, my hands steady, and started to write the final entry for the evening. The truth wasn't a secret anymore. It was a fact. And soon, it would be the only thing anyone would talk about. I felt the familiar weight of the responsibility I had carried for so long, but it was different now. It was no longer a burden I was forced to shoulder. It was a shield, and I would carry it right into the middle of the ballroom. I walked to the kitchen and made a cup of tea, the steam rising in the quiet air. I stood by the window and looked out at the night. I was ready. I was done waiting. I was going to be the one who finally spoke. I drank the tea, feeling the warmth spread through me, the coldness of the day finally fading. I had a life to live, and I would not let him steal another second of it. I finished the cup, washed it, and placed it on the rack. I would sleep tonight, not because I was tired, but because I had the strength to see it through. The final act was about to begin, and I would be at the center of it, the orchestrator of my own liberation. The evening light turned the walls of my father's mansion into a gallery of expensive shadows. I stood in the foyer, the cold marble beneath my heels, a stark reminder of why I had chosen to live in a townhouse instead. Harold Rourke sat in the study, the door left slightly ajar, his voice a low, commanding rumble that filled the hallway. I didn't need to knock. I walked straight to the entrance, the folder for the upcoming gala tucked under my arm like a shield. "Megan," Harold said, not looking up from his desk. He gestured toward the velvet chair opposite him with a flick of his wrist. "Sit. We have matters to discuss before the signing ceremony." Diane drifted in from the garden, her presence a silent, watchful shadow near the door. She looked at me with an expression of manufactured concern that she had worn since the luncheon. I chose to remain standing. My father looked older in the lamplight, the lines around his eyes etched with the stress of the mounting audit, but his arrogance remained unshaken. "You have the folder," he said, tapping the leather cover under my arm. "Sign it, and this nonsense with the command review ends. I have already spoken to a contact within the department. One signature, and the complaint vanishes." "You keep talking about complaints as if they are favors you grant," I replied, my voice cool. "That is not how the law works, Harold. That is not how justice works." He stood up, his face darkening. He walked toward me, his shadow stretching across the floor. "I have built this family out of nothing. I have provided for every single person in this house. You owe me the loyalty of a daughter." "I owe you the truth," I said. "And the truth is that you have spent the last 6 months building a fraud. I am not signing the media release." He reached out and grabbed my shoulder, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "You will not destroy this company. You will not destroy the work of a lifetime because you are too stubborn to understand the game." I didn't flinch. I stared him down, seeing the man behind the CEO for the first time, a desperate man, terrified that his house of cards was about to fall. I looked at the desk, at the ceremonial folder he had prepared, and I felt the cold, sharp edge of the evidence I had collected. He didn't know about the voicemail Paige had captured. He didn't know that his own control had become the very thing that ensured his demise. "Keep the inheritance," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I reached into my bag and pulled out the key to the family lake house, setting it on the polished mahogany of his desk. "I have my own home. I have my own accounts. I have my own life. You do not own me, and you certainly do not own my signature." Harold looked at the key as if it were a venomous snake. He turned to Diane, his eyes wild with fury. "Get her out of here. She is making a mistake she will regret for the rest of her life." "The only mistake being made here is yours," I answered, turning to leave. I walked past Diane, who stood motionless, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and realization. I didn't say a word to her. I didn't have to. She knew now that the path she had chosen was not the path of safety. I reached the front door and looked back one final time. Harold was standing by the desk, his hand hovering over the ceremonial folder as if he still believed it would save him. I didn't look at the study again. I opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. The freedom that washed over me was intoxicating. I had faced him, I had stood my ground, and I had left his house without losing a single piece of myself. As I drove toward the highway, my phone chimed with a message from Paige. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the attachment, a voicemail file, captured during an argument in the home office. I pulled over to the side of the road, the silence of the night wrapping around the car. I pressed play, hearing my father's voice, clear and cold, outlining his plan to send a second complaint if I refused to sign at the gala. It was proof, physical proof, of the coercion he had kept hidden in the dark corners of his life. I saved the file, the sense of victory settling deep within my bones. He was already losing, and he was too arrogant to even realize that the very people he had tried to silence were the ones who had finally spoken. The weight of the voicemail on my phone felt like an anchor, pulling my focus into the depths of the case. Paige had handed me that file with trembling hands, her eyes searching mine for a reassurance I could not fully give. She stood in my living room, clutching a small suitcase, a witness who had finally chosen the truth over the comfort of her father's mansion. I embraced her, but my terms remained firm. She would have to provide her testimony directly to the investigators, without shielding Diane or softening the account of that night. Sarah Kim filed the preservation notice to the Meridian Corporate Ethics Council the following morning, ensuring that the marketing records, signature files, and bank transfers remained untouched by my father's reach. I kept my head down at the office, meeting every cold glare and whispered gossip with the unwavering discipline of a soldier. My extended family had begun to reach out, sending messages that echoed Harold's narrative about my supposed ingratitude, but I saved every correspondence and forwarded them to my attorney without a single reply. The outside counsel for Meridian had been working under the silent direction of the Audit and Risk Committee. During a restricted briefing call, they assured Sarah that the forensic investigation was moving forward within a protected environment. They had confirmed that no breach of company systems had originated from my end, neutralizing the baseless accusation of corporate espionage. General Vale had been briefed at the board level, yet he maintained a professional distance, adhering to the strict internal protocols that kept the evidence under the control of the independent forensic team. I felt a spark of hope when I heard about Claire Donnelly. Through her legal counsel, she had provided a sworn statement regarding Martin Hale's direct instructions to manipulate my signature and backdate the media release. The realization that someone inside the company had risked their career to preserve the version history of those documents reminded me that Harold was no longer the only person controlling the flow of information. The atmosphere in my townhouse became a sanctuary of careful preparation. I reviewed my timeline until every date and event was burned into my mind. I was ready to face whatever came at the gala, though the path ahead was obscured by the inevitable chaos that would follow the reveal of the forged documents. One evening, just before the gala, the outside counsel reached out again. Their voice remained neutral, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion as they delivered the final warning. The audit committee had established a conditional hold on the signing authority, but it relied on the authenticity of the documents Harold intended to present. "Do not sign anything tomorrow," the voice warned. I looked at the photograph of the ceremonial folder, the leather grain catching the dim light of my room. "I was not planning to," I answered, my voice holding a resolve that had been forged in the fire of his betrayal. The game was no longer about his wealth or his influence. It was about the cold, hard reality of the records I had protected. He had spent his entire life manufacturing the truth, but the time for fabrication had come to an end. Every thread of his conspiracy was accounted for, and the wait for the final reveal at the gala felt like the final moments before a major tactical engagement. I had my gear packed, my evidence sorted, and my conscience clear. Tomorrow, the mask would finally fall away. The grand ballroom of the Potomac Grand Hotel glowed with the suffocating luxury of old money and corporate ambition. I stepped through the arched doors, the weight of my army blue mess uniform feeling like a second skin. Every medal pinned to my jacket carried a history I had earned, a stark contrast to the performative displays of power currently swirling around the room. I had secured my ethics clearance, the confirmation tucked securely in my pocket, ready to be presented if anyone dared to challenge my presence here. Harold stood near the stage, his gaze sweeping the crowd, like a king surveying his subjects. When his eyes locked onto mine, a thin, predatory smile creased his lips. He motioned for a photographer to approach, clearly intending to capture a moment of family unity that I had no intention of providing. I stepped neatly to the side, my movements practiced and precise, and informed the photographer that I would not be posing in front of the corporate logo. The silence that followed was small, but it was mine. Nearby, I spotted Paige. She looked pale, her hands clasped tightly over her clutch. She had been assigned a seat at the corporate table, but I caught her gaze and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. Paige had quietly asked the nonprofit coordinator for a different seat, and the coordinator had moved her to the honorees table without announcing the change. It kept her beyond Harold's immediate reach, keeping her away from Harold's immediate reach. He noticed the shift in her seating, his jaw tightening, yet he was trapped by the presence of 200 guests. He had to keep smiling. He had to keep playing the part of the patriarch. When my name was called for the recognition of my mentoring work, I walked to the stage. I spoke clearly about the service members who had successfully transitioned into new careers, focusing entirely on their resilience. I did not mention Rourke Sentinel. I did not thank my father. Harold stood in the wings, his applause hesitant, his frustration palpable as the audience gave me a genuine, respectful ovation that had nothing to do with his brand. The disaster began during the transition to the contract signing. Nicole Mercer hurried onto the stage, her high heels clicking aggressively against the wood. She pressed a ceremonial folder into my hands, her voice a forced, professional whisper. "The board approved this, Megan. Just stand at the backdrop for 10 seconds, she urged, her eyes darting toward the side stage where Harold watched, expectant and hungry. I opened the folder. Inside, a media release lay waiting, backdated by 6 months and bearing a signature that was a pale, copied imitation of my own. I didn't reach for the pen. I didn't argue. I simply looked up at Nicole, my voice calm enough to carry across the front rows of the audience. "I have never signed this document," I announced, the stillness of the room suddenly absolute. "This is not my endorsement. It is a forgery." The color drained from Nicole's face, leaving her looking like a porcelain doll shattered in place. Harold surged forward, the mask finally slipping. He grabbed the microphone from the stand, his face a mottled, angry red. He paced toward me, the ceremonial gold pen clenched in his fist as if it were a weapon. "Take off those ridiculous medals," he roared, the sound echoing off the high, gilded ceiling. I held my ground, my back straight, my chin lifted. "They are not yours to remove," I retorted, the words sharp and steady. He moved with a speed that startled the crowd, his palm connecting with my cheek in a stinging, violent blur. My head jerked to the side, a flash of white heat blinding my vision for a heartbeat. I tasted iron, but I didn't fall. I didn't make a sound. I looked out into the crowd and saw the flashes of dozens of smartphones, the recording lights blinking like hundreds of tiny, judgmental eyes. Halcyon medical representatives stood up, their faces etched with shock, as their own legal counsel began moving toward the stage to stop the ceremony. He raised his hand for a second blow, his eyes wild. Before the strike could land, General Raymond Vale stepped from the shadows of the wings. He moved with a heavy, deliberate authority, locking Harold's wrist in a grip that stopped the motion entirely. Vale didn't hold a report. He didn't need to. He stood there, a 4-star officer who had seen the damage done by men like my father, and looked at Harold with pure, chilling disdain. "Lieutenant Colonel Rourke," Vale said, turning toward me. He snapped a crisp, perfect salute, his eyes locking with mine. Our team traced the complaint. 8 words. The room felt as if it had been vacuumed of oxygen. Harold's face went pasty, his legs visibly trembling under the strain of Vale's hold. Outside counsel appeared on the stage, their movements professional and surgical. They stepped forward and took the ceremonial folder, securing the forged release within an evidence bag, under the watchful eye of the hotel security team and the audit chair of the board. "The signing is suspended," Vale announced, his voice reverberating through the ballroom. "The board meets now." The audit chair stepped up, his expression grim. He looked at Harold, who was still gasping for air, and held out his hand. "Your badge, Harold. Your company phone." Now, Harold turned to me, his eyes wide and pleading, the facade of the powerful CEO completely demolished by the presence of his own failures. "Tell them this is a family misunderstanding," he hissed, his voice cracking. I looked at him, seeing the small, desperate man who had spent years trying to erase the very daughter he had failed to control. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel the need for vengeance. I only felt the clean, cold relief of the truth finally being made public. "No," I replied, the word falling into the silence like a stone into a dark, deep well. I turned away from him, ignoring the frantic whispers of the guests and the frantic movements of the security detail. I walked off that stage, leaving the gold pen, the forged signatures, and the broken remnants of my father's empire behind me. I didn't check to see who was watching. I didn't look back at the chaos. I knew the board would vote to suspend him. I knew the forensic report would finalize his termination, and I knew that, for the first time in my life, I was finally the one in charge of my own exit. The sting on my... We had faded to a dull, throbbing ache by the time I sat in the secure holding room, but the adrenaline still hummed through my veins. Hotel security had been thorough, and I had handed over my statement with the calm, clinical precision of a field report. Sarah sat beside me, her eyes tracking the movement of people in the hallway. We watched the chaos of the gala through the half-open door, the guests scrambling for their coats, the hushed, frantic conversations, and the way the halcyon executives kept their distance from the Rourke entourage. My phone buzzed against the table. A message from Colonel Bennett. He had seen the clips. He had heard the reports. For now, my status remained unchanged, but the administrative review would be expedited. I felt a small, quiet satisfaction in knowing that the record would soon reflect the truth. "The board is in session," Sarah said, her attention shifting to her laptop screen. "They are reviewing the forensic evidence and the video. The audit chair has not left the room for 2 hours." I didn't need to be there to see it. I could imagine the faces of those men who had trusted Harold for decades as they watched the version history of the complaint, as they listened to the voice of their own legal counsel explaining how they had been manipulated into facilitating a fraud. It was not the public destruction I had once imagined. It was a slow, agonizing dismantling of his reputation from the inside out. An aide from the board walked into the room, his expression unreadable. He placed a folder on the table. "The emergency session has concluded. Mr. Rourke has been suspended pending the final report. You are free to leave, Colonel." I stood, my uniform feeling heavier than before. We walked out of the back entrance of the hotel, away from the reporters and the lingering cameras. The cool night air hit me, clear and sharp. "He tried to blame Nicole," Sarah said as we reached the car. "He told the board that she had acted on her own, without his knowledge, regarding the military endorsement deck." "Nicole will not take that fall alone," I answered, watching the city traffic drift by. "She knows exactly who signed the checks for the reputation agency. Martin Hale will not stay silent either, not when his own bar standing is on the line." I thought of the boardroom, the smell of mahogany and stale air, and the way my father had shrunk when the evidence was presented. He was a man who had built a kingdom on the assumption that no one would ever dare to look behind the curtain. He had never considered that I was the one who had kept the keys to the storage room. The next morning, I arrived at the office early. The atmosphere was different. The silence that greeted me was not the cold, dismissive silence of the past few weeks, but one of cautious waiting. The internal matter was now an open investigation, and the company was reeling from the loss of its central pillar. I sat at my desk and looked at my computer, the screen flickering with the routine tasks that now felt like a different lifetime. I had a life to reclaim. I had a reputation to rebuild, one that was not tethered to his name. I looked at my phone and saw a voicemail from Paige. I pressed play, my heart tightening as I listened to her voice. She was terrified. She was alone. She had been cast out of the mansion, and Diane was refusing to speak to her for fear of being dragged further into the investigation. I stood up and grabbed my jacket. I didn't care about the risk of being seen or the mess of the situation. I drove to the apartment complex where she had taken a temporary room, the drive feeling far too long. When I opened the door, she was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. I gave them the voicemail, Paige whispered, her hands gripping a small cup of tea. I told them everything. I did not soften the story for Diane, just like you told me. You did the right thing, I said, sitting beside her. You chose the truth, and that is all anyone can ask of you. Are we going to be okay? She asked, looking up at me. We are going to be ourselves, I replied. That is the only way we are going to make it through this. I returned to my own home that evening, feeling the weight of the last several months shifting. I spent hours reading through the initial findings the audit committee had released to the senior leadership team. They had mapped the entire conspiracy, the drafting of the narrative by Nicole, the legal manipulation by Martin, and the direct, documented instructions from Harold's executive office. The evidence was devastating. It was all there, in black and white, the final nails in the coffin of his career. But the most difficult part of the day was the civil lawsuit Sarah had prepared. It was a formal request for damages, covering everything from the forged consent to the assault at the gala. I sat at my desk, looking at the request for a protective order regarding the personal audio recording Diane had provided. I did not want that recording in the public record. I did not want my most private pain to become entertainment for a jury or the press. I looked at the screen, my finger hovering over the request for the protective order. It was the last piece of myself I had to protect. I tapped the screen and sent the request. I was willing to sacrifice the total claim against Diane if it meant the recording remained sealed. My dignity was worth more than the money she could ever pay. I walked to the window, the city lights below mirroring the complexity of the situation. My father was a suspended CEO, a man being hunted by his own board, his own counsel, and his own daughter. He was alone. He had everything he had ever wanted, and he was completely, utterly empty. I knew he would try one final move. He was a man who defined himself by the ability to control the outcomes of his environment. I waited, the quiet of the townhouse a stark, refreshing contrast to the storm I had lived through. A messenger arrived at my door the next morning, carrying a heavy manila envelope. I didn't need to open it to know what was inside. I laid it on the kitchen table and pulled out the document. It was a draft statement, written in his familiar, aggressive script. It was a demand for me to sign away my testimony, to tell the board that the gala had been a misunderstanding, to protect the legacy he had destroyed. At the bottom of the page, in his own handwriting, was the demand: sign this, and I will stop fighting. I didn't feel a flicker of hesitation. I didn't feel the need to argue. I walked over to my desk and picked up a pen. I didn't sign the document. I pulled a clean sheet of paper, addressed it to his counsel, and typed the response that Sarah had helped me prepare. Lieutenant Colonel Rourke will not alter truthful testimony. I placed the paper in an envelope and handed it to the messenger. I watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the distance. It was done. I had made my final choice. I was no longer the daughter who was afraid of her father's reaction. I was the woman who had already weathered the worst of his wrath, and I was still standing. I went back inside, the air in the house feeling cleaner, lighter than it had in months. I made myself a cup of coffee and stood at the window, watching the sunrise. It was a new day, the first day of a future I had finally earned. Harold could fight all he wanted, but he was fighting a war against the truth, and he had already lost. I had my rank, I had my honor, and I had the person I had fought so hard to protect. I was finally, truly free. The final resolution did not arrive in a single cinematic stroke, but in the slow, grinding machinery of corporate and legal consequences. 6 weeks after, Harold was terminated for cause, a designation that stripped him of his salary, his severance, and his unvested bonuses. The company, now led by an interim chief executive officer and a compliance monitor, moved quickly to distance itself from his leadership, filing claims to claw back the bonuses he had received while overseeing the fraud. His defense costs began to escalate rapidly as his directors and officers' insurance provider issued a letter reserving their rights to deny coverage for his intentional misconduct, forcing him to pay his mounting legal fees from his own dwindling personal assets. I watched the news of his professional unraveling with a detachment I had not expected to feel. The Halcyon Medical Network had reached a new agreement with the company, their trust restored only after the leadership had been purged of the toxic influence that had nearly cost the firm its reputation. General Vale had publicly stated that the contract stood on the merits of the workforce, not on the manufactured military endorsements of a single family, effectively ending the charade Harold had built. The collateral damage of the investigation was widespread. Nicole Mercer found her career in communications effectively dead after potential employers reviewed the internal records of the campaign design. Martin Hale faced a formal disciplinary review from the State Bar regarding the manipulation of signature documents and the destruction of evidence, a professional stain that no amount of legal maneuvering could wash away. Diane, stripped of her position at the foundation following a rigorous, donor-led audit, found her social circle closing ranks against her, eventually prompting her to leave the state to avoid the fallout of her complicity. Paige, having moved into a modest apartment far from the influence of the mansion, began working for a nonprofit that actually practiced the values she had once only heard about in marketing decks. My civil lawsuit against Harold and the other responsible parties moved through the system with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. The settlement included a formal written correction regarding the unauthorized use of my likeness, a total prohibition on the usage of my name or military rank in any of their future marketing materials, and a significant damages award. As I had planned, the bulk of those funds was transferred to an independent scholarship pool dedicated to military spouses and service members transitioning into the civilian sector. I ensured that no name mine or his was attached to the fund so that it could exist purely as a tool for those who genuinely needed the help. Harold requested one final meeting in a neutral mediation room, a stark, sterile space that lacked the grandiosity of his home study. He looked diminished, his posture less rigid, his eyes lacking the predatory focus that had once terrified me. He spoke of the sacrifices he had made to provide for the family and asked me one last time to sign a statement that would allow him to salvage a fraction of his legacy. I placed a copy of his email, the one containing his command to manufacture my consent, on the table between us. "You did not lose me when I testified," I told him, my voice steady in the quiet room. "You lost me when you decided my consent was a detail you could manufacture." He stared at the paper, his hands trembling slightly, the arrogance he had worn like armor for so long finally slipping away into the sterile light of the room. He searched my face for a flicker of the daughter who used to believe his lies, but he found only the firm, unwavering gaze of a woman who had seen the truth and refused to look away. When he asked if I would forgive him, I did not offer a lie to make the moment easier. Forgiveness, if it ever came, would not change the testimony, the board findings, or the wreckage of the lives he had disrupted. I left the room without signing his statement, and my legal counsel submitted the final refusal to his attorneys shortly thereafter. Walking out of that building, I felt the weight of the last several months shifting from my shoulders. I had carried the burden of his secrets, the weight of his manipulation, and the pressure of his expectations for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to simply be myself. The air outside was crisp, carrying the promise of a future that belonged entirely to me. The epilogue to this chapter was written in the simple rhythm of my own life. Months later, I stood before a small group of transitioning service members at a workshop, civilian clothes marking the end of the public spectacle. I spoke to them not as an endorsement, but as a peer, sharing the lessons I had learned about boundaries and duty. I went home to my townhouse, retrieved the index card I had kept since the gala, and locked it away in a storage box. I did not burn the evidence, for I no longer needed to pretend that the past had not occurred. I only needed to ensure it could no longer hold power over my future. The lesson I carried forward was simple and absolute. My father had taught me that family was a debt I was expected to pay with my own autonomy. The life I built had taught me the truth that love might ask for sacrifice, but it could never ask for the total erasure of oneself. I closed the lid on the box, listening to the soft click of the lock, and walked out into the morning sunlight. The phone in my pocket remained silent, and for the first time, I felt no compulsion to check it for his name. I was finally the woman I had been trying to become, and the view from where I stood was worth every battle I had fought to reach it. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the bustle of the city, the ordinary, beautiful chaos of people living lives that were entirely their own. There were no hidden agendas, no forged signatures, and no games to play. There was only the steady, reliable truth of the morning. I turned toward the station, my pace steady and my resolve unshakable, knowing that I would never again be the person who waited for someone else's permission to exist. The past was a closed book, and I was looking forward to the blank pages of a story that I would finally write myself. You have heard my story, and now you stand at the crossroads of your own, holding the weight of expectations that were never yours to carry. It is easy to believe that because someone raised you, or because they share your blood, they have earned the right to define your worth or dictate the boundaries of your integrity. You have likely spent years, as I did, trying to earn love through utility, performing roles that diminished your spirit simply to keep the peace, or protect a legacy that was built on a foundation of shifting sand. The lesson is this: your value is not a negotiable asset, and it is certainly not a currency you should trade to buy the approval of those who view you only as a tool for their own advancement. When you allow others to manufacture your consent, you are not being loyal, you are being erased. True integrity does not require you to hold a match to your own life just to keep someone else warm. You have the absolute right to draw a line in the sand and stand behind it, even when the person pushing you toward the edge is someone you have been taught to love and honor since childhood. If you are currently trapped in a situation where you feel you must sacrifice your truth to maintain an image of family harmony, understand that the cost is far higher than any temporary comfort you gain from silence. The only way to win a game designed by a manipulator is to refuse to play by their rules, which means you must prioritize your own records, your own documentation, and your own autonomy above their need for control. You are not responsible for their failures. You are not obligated to protect their reputation at the expense of your own, and you are not required to participate in the dismantling of your own soul. The moment you realize that your silence is their greatest weapon is the moment you reclaim your power. It is terrifying, yes, to step away from the structure you have always known, but the view from the other side is one of clarity and genuine strength. You do not have to be the person they invented to satisfy their greed or their ego. You are the architect of your own history, and it is time to start writing a narrative that actually belongs to you. Look at your own life right now and ask yourself, What is one boundary you have been afraid to set because you fear the reaction of the very person who is currently taking advantage of your kindness? Think about the documents, the memories, and the truths you have been keeping hidden because you think they are too painful to face or too explosive to unleash. You have the strength to stand up, just as I did, and you do not need anyone's permission to do what is right. What would change in your life today if you finally stopped waiting for the person who betrayed you to acknowledge the damage they have done, and instead started doing the work to secure your own future without them? Are you ready to let go of the debt they convinced you to pay and accept that your freedom is a price that is worth every single bridge you might have to burn to get there?